So we've just explored how Descartes was wrestling with algebra and abstract reasoning. But that groundwork leads us straight into the heart of his metaphysical project, where he really starts to shake things up. In the Regulae, specifically Rule 12, he first talks about ideas in terms familiar to Aristotle, figures in the imagination. But then, bam, he drops this bombshell concept, simple nature. Now, don't let the name fool you. This isn't just a fancy new label. It's a fundamental shift in how we understand knowledge itself. Think of it as Descartes hitting the reset button on what we know and how we know it. So, what exactly is this simple nature? It's got two rather counterintuitive features. First, it's not really nature in the old sense. Forget Aristotle's essence or physis. Descartes is saying, look, when we talk about things, we're not talking about them as they are in themselves, in their ultimate reality. We're talking about them as they appear to our knowledge. Our knowledge isn't some mirror reflecting reality, it's the starting point. The nature here is whatever is the first thing we can grasp, the simplest object for our understanding, regardless of what it actually is in itself. This effectively kicks traditional essence out of the game, banishing it from modern metaphysics. Second, it's not truly simple in the way we usually think of simplicity, like an atom being indivisible. No, Descartes' simplicity is relative. It's about what seems simplest to the mind at that moment. Take a body, he breaks it down into extension, shape, movement. But wait, shape could be broken down further into extension and limit. Yet, because limit is more abstract and applies to more things, like duration, movement, it's considered complex from our knowledge perspective. So simple nature means epistemologically simple, easy to know clearly and distinctly, not ontologically simple. It's all about the clarity of our grasp, not the thing's inherent nature. This leads directly to Descartes' radical redefinition of an idea. For him, an idea isn't some platonic form or essence inherent in things. An idea is simply the primary object of our knowledge. It's primary because it's easy for us to grasp, because it's clear and distinct. Think about it. If you can't even conceive of something clearly, how can you claim to know it? This definition completely sidesteps the whole debate about whether ideas are innate, acquired, or innate copies. Instead, it makes the idea fundamentally tied to the act of knowing, to the intellect's ability to perceive it. It's not about the thing's essence, but about the mental act of apprehending it. This is purely Cartesian, a concept born from his specific epistemological concerns. Okay, so we have this idea of simple nature. How does Descartes categorize them? Rule 12 gives us a neat list, grouping them into three main types. First, there are the purely intellectual ones. These are things like knowledge, doubt, ignorance, the will. You don't need senses or imagination for these. Pure reason is enough. Second, there are the purely material ones. These are the building blocks of physical reality, extension, shape, movement. To grasp these, you need your imagination, picture a cube, feel the push of a force. Third, and interestingly, there are common simple natures, or common notions. These are split again. Some are real common natures, applying broadly, like existence, unity, duration, things that apply whether you're thinking about thoughts or physical objects. Others are logical common natures, acting like links between other concepts, like the principle that if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. These are the rules of logic that hold things together. So why bother with all these simple natures? Descartes had a grand vision, to build a mathesis universalis, a universal mathematics or science. The idea was to create a single unified method for all knowledge. He saw these simple natures as the fundamental building blocks, the raw data for this universal system. Of course, just having the building blocks isn't enough. You also need rules for putting them together. That's where theories of order come in, covered in rules V through 7. And finally, you need a way to measure or quantify these things, which is tackled in Rule of 14. The goal was ambitious, a single scientific method applicable everywhere. But here's the twist. Look closer at how Descartes actually uses these simple natures in the Regulae. While he lists them all, his application is surprisingly selective. He dives deep into using the material simple natures, extension, shape, movement, and the common ones that link them to solve problems in geometry, optics, physics, magnetism. all the hard sciences. But the purely intellectual simple natures, knowledge, doubt, will, they get listed, sure, but they don't show up in the actual scientific work he outlines there. Why the silence? Because using them would require a different kind of thinking altogether. It would mean reasoning purely intellectually, dealing with abstract concepts like the mind or God, things you can't touch or see. That's metaphysics, not the hands-on science he's building in the Regulae. Science deals with the material world, grasped by senses and imagination. Metaphysics deals with the immaterial, grasped by pure understanding. They seem to belong to different worlds. This leads to a crucial distinction Descartes highlights later, around 1630 onwards, and it becomes a major theme: the divide between metaphysics and the sciences, like physics and mathematics. It turns out the split in the types of simple natures mirrors the split in the faculties and sciences. The material simple natures, grasped by imagination, belong to physics and mathematics. The intellectual simple natures, grasped by understanding, belong to metaphysics. Descartes even says it bluntly: the part of the mind which is of most help in mathematics does more harm than good in metaphysical speculations. He also notes the common pattern. People who excel in metaphysics often hate geometry, while those who master geometry struggle with his first philosophy. It's like two different modes of thinking, two different territories. The appearance of homogeneity in the list of simple natures is deceptive. They actually belong to radically different domains. And here's the kicker. Descartes himself says metaphysics transcends and provides the foundation for the sciences. Metaphysics is supposed to be the bedrock. So, if the Regulae already contains the conceptual tools for metaphysics, the intellectual simple natures, why doesn't he use them to build that foundation right there? Why does he stop at constructing a theory of science? It's puzzling. He acknowledges the domain of thought, the realm of the intellectual natures, but he doesn't develop it. It's like having the ingredients for a cake, but only baking cookies. The question hangs in the air: why the hesitation? But hold on. Before we conclude the Regulae is purely scientific, let's look again. It actually gets surprisingly close to metaphysics. Yes, it lists the intellectual natures. But even earlier in Rule 3, it tries to connect them. Remember the examples of intuitive knowledge? Before diving into triangles and spheres, Descartes mentions something profound. Everyone can mentally intuit that he exists, that he is thinking. That's a direct hit. It juxtaposes an intellectual nature, thinking, with a real common nature, existing. What's missing? Just the necessary link between them. The components of the famous cogito, I think therefore I am, are all there: thought, intellectual, existence, common, doubt, linked to thought in Rule 12, and even a hint towards God's existence. I am, therefore God exists. All the pieces are present. So why no cogito yet? The author argues it's not a lack of concepts or inability to link them. It's simply the failure to establish the necessary order, the logical connection between these simple natures. The potential is there, but the final step of ordering them into a coherent metaphysical proposition hasn't been taken. So, the hypothesis presented here is quite compelling. The Regulae holds all the conceptual ingredients for Descartes' early metaphysics, the intellectual simple natures. But it lacks the crucial ingredient, the necessary order, the logical principle that connects these natures together. Think of it like having all the letters of the alphabet, the simple natures, but not knowing the grammar rules, the necessary order to form words and sentences, metaphysical propositions like the cogito. The failure to articulate the cogito isn't due to ignorance or incompatibility. It's a failure of organization. The transition to metaphysics hinges on establishing this order. Once that happens, the metaphysics emerges naturally from the elements already present. This perspective challenges Ferdinand Alquié's view, which drew a rough line between the Regulae and Discourse, focused on method, and the Meditations, focused on metaphysics. If our hypothesis is right, then metaphysics isn't something separate, added later. It's already embedded within the theory of method in the Regulae. But it's like a seed that hasn't sprouted yet. The potential is there, but the conditions, the necessary ordering, aren't met. The frontier between method and metaphysics isn't an absolute wall separating two distinct periods, but rather a dynamic process of realization. The metaphysical elements are latent within the methodological framework. How can we test this idea? Let's look at other texts. Consider Descartes' letters to Mersenne in 1630. Here he explicitly uses the term metaphysical and makes a startling claim. Mathematical truths, the ones we call eternal, were established by God and depend entirely on Him. Think about that. He throws down a gauntlet against the prevailing view. He argues God could have made it false that all radii of a circle are equal, just as easily as he could have decided not to create the world at all. This example echoes the ones he used in Rule 3 to illustrate simple natures. What does this imply? It suggests that the mathematical truths we rely on in science, built from material simple natures like extension and shape, linked by common natures like equality, are themselves created by God. Therefore, these material and common natures are subordinate to the metaphysical authority of God. They are part of the created order, governed by divine will. What are the consequences of this view that mathematical truths are created? First, it reinforces the distinction we saw earlier. When Descartes talks about subordination to God's creative power, he's primarily referring to the material and common simple natures. The intellectual natures like thought and will seem to remain outside this direct subordination in this context. Second, it shows how metaphysics governs physics. The ultimate authority in physics, the laws of mathematics that regulate it, ultimately derive from God's creative power. Physics operates within the bounds set by metaphysics. Third, this strongly suggests that the frontier between science and metaphysics isn't just a simple timeline difference between the regulae and the meditations. It cuts right through the domain of the simple natures themselves. There's a fundamental difference between the types of natures involved in science and those potentially involved in metaphysics. Let's check another source. The Principles of Philosophy. Part 1 is explicitly about metaphysics. After laying out his theory of truth and error, Descartes revisits these simple notions. And guess what? He categorizes them again, very much like in the Regulae, but now from a fully metaphysical standpoint. He identifies three main types. First, the maxima generalia, the most general items like substance, existence, duration, order, number, which clearly correspond to the real common natures. Second, extended substance, explained via size, extension, shape, position, matching the material simple natures. Third, thinking substance, explained via perception and will, corresponding to the intellectual simple natures. And then, crucially, he adds a fourth category. Eternal truths, which include logical axioms like the principle of non-contradiction, and perhaps some of the created mathematical truths. The key takeaway? The Principles takes the doctrine of simple natures from the Regulae and builds the entire metaphysical system upon it, treating it as foundational. Okay, so we have evidence from the Regulae suggesting metaphysics is latent, evidence from the 1630 letters suggesting metaphysics governs via subordination, and evidence from the Principles suggesting metaphysics integrates all types. Is there an inconsistency here? Does Descartes flip-flop, or is there a deeper coherence? To resolve this puzzle, we need to dive into the core of his metaphysical project, the Meditations. Can we find the simple natures playing a role there? And if so, how do they relate to method and metaphysics? Does method serve metaphysics, or is it somehow diminished by it? The argument proposed here is quite bold. We should read the entire Meditations as a complex interplay of these different types of simple natures. The metaphysics of 1641 doesn't throw out the elements developed in the 1627 Regulae. Instead, it takes those elements and uses them in a radically new, perfected way. It brings the potential of the Regulae to full fruition. We'll unpack this by looking at how the different types of simple natures play out in specific meditations, starting with the first, then the fifth, and finally tackling the trickiest case in the third meditation. Let's start with the first meditation. What does Descartes throw into doubt first? Not necessarily the complex truths of mathematics, though they come up. He starts with what he calls simpler and more universal things. Things like stretching out your hand, moving your head. What are these? They are precisely the material simple natures. Extension, shape, size, place, time. The list matches Rule 12 almost exactly. Why target these? Because they are presented as the basis for knowing even sensory perceptions. But crucially, the hyperbolic doubt aims only at these material and related common natures. They enter the realm of metaphysics in the first meditation, but only to be thrown out. They are disqualified. This aligns perfectly with the idea from the 1630 letters. The mathematical truths built upon these material foundations are transcended by metaphysics when God's creative power is invoked. So the material natures are thrown out in the first meditation. What happens next? In the fifth meditation, after Descartes has rebuilt his certainty based on God's existence and reliability, what does he do? He rehabilitates these very same natures. He says, okay, God exists and is a reliable guarantor of truth. Therefore, I can trust my clear and distinct perceptions again. And what are the first things he trusts? Not the complex mathematical theorems, but the underlying true and immutable natures that make them possible. Extension, shape, size, position, motion, duration. These are the material simple natures, now reinstated as the true object of ideas existing in thought. It's like restoring the original code that was invalidated by doubt. This shows the central role of these natures. Their status determines the status of mathematics, and thus indirectly physics. This rehabilitation of the material and common natures in the fifth meditation has a direct consequence. It allows Descartes to rediscover the validity of pure and abstract mathematics. This pura mathesis is essentially the mathesis universalis he envisioned in the regulae, but now grounded in God's certainty. Its object is corporeal nature, the realm of the material simple natures. So, the whole structure of the meditations, testing the certainty of the sciences, makes perfect sense if we see it as centered on the fate of these material natures. Their reinstatement allows the sciences built upon them to be validated. The thread running through the meditations is the status and certainty of these fundamental material concepts. All right, we've seen the material natures get thrown out and back in. But remember the other half of the story. The purely intellectual simple natures, knowledge, doubt, will, understanding. Where do they fit into this drama? The fifth meditation mentions achieving knowledge of countless other matters, both concerning God himself and other things whose nature is intellectual. But it doesn't really delve into them. Their starring role comes in the second meditation. The second meditation is where the intellectual natures truly shine. It can be read as a systematic exploration of all four types of simple natures. The intellectual ones, cognition, doubt, ignorance, volition, are gathered under the banner of res cogitans, the thinking thing. What Descartes calls cognition in the regulae becomes thought or cogitatio here. Doubt becomes dubitans, that doubts. Ignorance relates to affirming or denying, and the will's action becomes willing or unwilling. For the first time, the res cogitans takes these previously idle concepts and gives them a metaphysical role. They become the very modes or activities of the thinking self. The thinking thing cannot think without deploying these intellectual natures. Pure reason, now operating metaphysically, acknowledges them as essential aspects of its own being. Now, how does the res cogitans establish its own existence? Through the common natures, specifically the real common natures. The cogito, I am, I exist, is essentially the act of employing the common nature of existence. When Descartes says, I am, I exist, that is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking, he's also invoking the common nature of duration. So the ego identifies itself as a thinking thing by combining the intellectual natures it thinks with the real common natures. It exists, and it exists for a duration. It's the combination of these two types of natures that allows the self to be defined. But how do we get from I think, an intellectual nature, to I exist, a real common nature? What's the bridge? This is where the logical common natures come in. The regulae hinted at this but didn't fully articulate it. The principles later state a key axiom. He who is thinking cannot but exist so long as he is thinking. This principle explicitly links an intellectual activity, thinking, to a real existence. The second meditation implicitly relies on this kind of necessary link, even if it expresses it slightly differently. Were I totally to cease from thinking, I should totally cease to exist. This logical principle is the missing link that connects the intellectual and real aspects of the self, allowing the move from the cogito to the assertion of the res cogitans existence. Of course, the material natures do pop up in the second meditation, famously in the analysis of the piece of wax. But Descartes uses this analysis to make a crucial point. The res cogitans, the thinking self, has priority over material things. He shows how the sensible qualities of the wax, taste, smell change, but the underlying determinable aspect that it's extended, flexible, changeable remains. And ultimately, even this determinable aspect is known and understood through purely mental scrutiny. The three key material natures, extension, shape, movement, are shown to be subordinate to the intellectual natures of the mind. The result of the second meditation is a reversal of the hierarchy seen in the regulae, where the regulae focused on material natures and sidelined the intellectual ones. The second meditation elevates the intellectual natures, placing the thinking self above the material world. This way of reading the meditations also offers a neat solution to the infamous Cartesian circle problem. How can Descartes use the clarity and distinctness of ideas, including the idea of God, to prove God's existence, and then use God's existence to guarantee the reliability of those same ideas? The proposed answer is that the distinction between types of simple natures breaks the circle. The first meditation's doubt only targets the material simple natures. The intellectual simple natures, thought, existence, doubt, will, are never subjected to this radical doubt. They are inherently immune. So when Descartes uses the intellectual comps natures, the cogito, the idea of God, to argue for God's existence, he's building on a foundation, the certainty of these natures, that was never threatened by the hyperbolic doubt. The foundation is secure before the conclusion is drawn. The circle dissolves because the different types of natures operate in distinct epistemological spheres. Okay, so the meditations successfully establish the certainty of the intellectual and material natures, and the reliability of the sciences built upon them, thanks to God's existence. But how does God fit into this picture? How does his existence guarantee the truth of these natures? This is where the third meditation comes in, aiming to prove God's existence. The idea is that once we have God, we have a guarantee that our clear and distinct perceptions, including those involving the simple natures, are reliable. But this move introduces some tricky philosophical maneuvers, especially regarding the concept of substance. To prove God, Descartes needs a concept that seems to go beyond the simple natures. He introduces the notion of substance. Interestingly, this is presented as one of the real common simple natures. This feels a bit like a late addition, and it seems to contradict his earlier critique of the traditional concept of substance in the regulae. Why bring it back? It's necessary to apply the word substance to God, making it both a common term, like a stone or a mind is a substance, and a special term unique to God. How does he pull this off? By adding the adjective infinite. God is described as infinita substantia, infinite substance. This adjective is crucial. It signals that while God is a substance, his infinitude makes him incomprehensible in the way finite substances are. He's intelligible but not fully graspable, thus keeping him distinct from and transcendent of the simple natures. So God's status is defined by this combination, substance plus infinity. The infinite aspect is key. Descartes argues that the very idea of the infinite, if it's to be a true idea, cannot be grasped or comprehended in the strict sense. The impossibility of being grasped is part of the definition of the infinite. This puts God at the extreme edge, or perhaps entirely outside, the domain of the simple natures, which by definition must be comprehensible. His power is also described as immense and incomprehensible. From the perspective of infinity, God remains unthinkable and inconceivable. He's the ultimate limit, the point beyond which the categories of the simple natures break down. So, let's try to summarize the levels of reality based on this analysis. At the base, we have the material simple natures. These are the ones thrown into doubt in the first meditation and then reinstated in the fifth. They form the basis of the mathesis universalis aimed at in the regulae. Above them, we have the intellectual simple natures. These are identified with the res cogitans, the thinking self, and they take precedence over the material natures, as shown in the second meditation. The human mind explores the potential of the mathesis universalis, and transcending both of these levels we find God. Introduced in the third meditation, God is defined as infinite substance, lying beyond the scope of the simple natures and the mathesis universalis. He represents an absolutely metaphysical horizon. But this neat schema isn't quite complete. There are textual details that complicate it. First, God exists. Existence is a real common simple nature. The necessary link between God's essence and his existence, discussed in the fifth meditation, reinforces this connection. Second, God thinks. God possesses the most important intellectual simple nature, thought or cogitatio. While not explicitly stated in the meditations themselves, this attribution appears in other Cartesian writings. So, the conclusion seems to be that all simple natures except the material ones relate to God, albeit always qualified by the concept of infinity. The intellectual and real common natures are aspects of the thinking self and its existence, and God shares the most fundamental intellectual nature, thought, with the res cogitans. If metaphysics, centered on the human mind, defined by intellectual and real common natures, relates to the simple natures, does that mean metaphysics is just a branch of mathesis universalis? The author argues no. The key lies in the very definition of mathesis universalis. It requires some order or measurement. Both ordering and measuring are possible with material things. But metaphysics deals with non-extended objects like the mind and God. These cannot be measured. In fact, God's infinity is precisely defined by his absolute incapability of being measured. So, metaphysics shares the first part of the definition of mathesis universalis, the ordering of simple natures, but rejects the second part, measurement. The true frontier lies in this difference. Metaphysics operates within the realm of order, but beyond the realm of measurement. Therefore, the meditations can be understood as the ultimate example of metaphysics, fulfilling the essence of mathesis universalis, the part about ordering. It's presented as a paradigm of ordered groups of simple natures. Descartes constantly emphasizes the proper order of my arguments. He achieves evident conclusions purely through this process of ordering, without ever resorting to measuring extension. So metaphysics, by focusing on the intellectual and real common natures and ordering them, fulfills the core requirement of the method. It accomplishes its aim entirely within the framework of the simple natures, bringing them to their full realization. The method and metaphysics aren't separate. They are deeply intertwined, sharing the root of rational ordering. So, the final takeaway is that far from metaphysics being an exception to Descartes' method, or ignoring the objects of method, the metaphysics of the meditations actually brings the simple natures to their fullest expression. It reveals that metaphysics alone can reach its own foundations, which were always part of the metaphysical domain. The method of rational ordering and the deployment of simple natures and metaphysics are shown to be uniquely grafted onto a single root. The entire project of the meditations unfolds using these simple natures, uncovering the necessary links between them and utilizing the principles of logic to achieve its profound metaphysical goals.